Hi, Eva. So let me introduce you. Eva is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, a philosopher, artist, and writer. She writes novels, philosophical essays, scientific texts, poetry, and columns, and her works have been translated into more than 20 languages. Recurring themes of her researches are language, including silence, madness, non-human animals, and politics. She writes features and columns for the NRC newspaper, and she is a member of the Multispecies Art Collective. Eva is also the author of a book, When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy, in which she develops a new revolutionary theory of language and politics, arguing that non-human animals speak and, most importantly, act politically. Eva provides real-life examples of animal communities who use their voices to speak and act for political purposes. So, Eva, the floor is yours. You can start.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your nice introduction, and also thanks to everybody else who came here this morning. It's nice to meet you, and I'm very glad that Mark and Jana have organized this conference, because I think it's very important to have these spaces where we can meet and discuss ideas in different cultural contexts. So I think that's it's a wonderful initiative. So I'm very glad to be here and to be able to support that. As Mark told you, I've been working on the connection between language and politics. I've written books about animal languages. Non-human animals are very often seen as mute, as incapable of speaking. But in fact, they have their own species-specific ways of communicating with each other. And the fact that we do not recognize this as humans is not an empirical question. It's not that we don't do enough research, but it's a political question. We deny them their voices, and obviously their languages are very different than human language. They use sounds, but also color, movement, and many other ways to speak with each other and also with humans. And the fact that we do not recognize this has to do with their position in society. It's political. But there are also other connections between politics and language. For example, inside language, we already find that in the word animal. We are now in a room called Derrida. And Derrida, of course, famously wrote that this is a violent word, the word animal, because it sets up a binary opposition between humans and animals, which doesn't recognize that humans are animals too, and that there are great differences between all of these non-human animals that are grouped together in this one group. But language also has a positive aspect when it comes to politics and democracy, because we use language and other tools, but also language, communicate ideas to others, to show them our standpoints. So the fact that non-human animals express themselves too, and you know that from your own experience, you know that there are ways in which they engage with each other, but also with humans. And the fact that they do, and that we often understand each other, but there are also misunderstandings. It's the same in the case of humans. So I don't mean to imply that it's all harmonious in some sense. But this idea that they speak has democratic consequences. They should be able to co-determine our common lives on this planet. And I think that as humans, we can learn a lot from other animals as well, because we are quite destructive as a species. So my work so far has focused a lot on teasing out these interconnections between language and politics, describing examples, case studies of humans and animals who interact, the role that language plays in that. I, for example, adopted a group of ex-laboratory mice, and I wrote about their language, their communication, their culture, their community. They didn't like me so much. It was mostly them, but we also had some interactions. But I never really discussed a model of politics. And that's a thing that political philosophers always want to do. You know, they want to develop a system. And humans want to have this system. I receive emails. I live in the Netherlands, and we have a party for the animals here. I will come back to that later if there's time. And the people want to know how we should engage with other animals in order to get their opinion on life. You know, what kind of political system do we need? What kind of political practices do we need? And I've avoided this question because I think that it's not up to me as a human to develop a system. You know, that's very problematic, because then I would again repeat this hierarchy of the humans who know best, instead of working with animals in order to get their opinion on our common societies. At the same time, I feel that it's necessary, because we live in this very destructive age, to develop some guidelines for how we can interact better with non-human animals and also the other beings with whom we share our planet. So I've been thinking about that, and I came up with an idea about multi-species assemblies. This was basically because I was asked to speak about citizens' participation of animals in the city of Gouda in the Netherlands, a small town. And there the idea came into my mind that this model of citizens' assembly is actually fruitful for thinking about relations with animals. So what I will do now, I wrote a text about this, and hopefully it's coming out in a couple of months. It's a text called Multispecies Assemblies. So if you are interested in that, please send me an email later. I will put my email address in the chat, and I will keep you posted about that. And today I will speak a bit about this idea of multi-species assembly. I will do this in 3 parts. I first discuss why we need multi-species assemblies. I then discuss the model in some detail. And I then discuss some steps that we can take towards multi-species assemblies. So first of all, the question, why do we need multi-species assemblies? Why do we need multi-species co-government? Is it not enough if humans decide how society should look and be structured? So for a very long time, concepts like political agency, justice, membership of the political community were regarded as human territory in the history of philosophy, but also in modern nation states and political practice. Non-humans, but also quite a lot of humans, think for example of women, were seen as lacking the capacities to be part of the political realm and excluded from decision making, and non-human animals were excluded from the moral community too. But in recent years, this idea has been challenged from a lot of different directions. In Western philosophy, for example, by philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, Sue Donaldson, and Will Kymlicka, who draw on insights from animal rights theory, and political philosophy to argue that we should take animals into account politically. But there are also ecofeminists like Carol Adams and Laurie Gruen who focus on oppression and interconnected systems of oppression. There's also a challenge from the perspective of new materialism to human-centered models of politics. Think, for example, of the work of Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett, who argue that not only humans exercise agency, but other beings do too, and we're always connected in assemblages in which we co-influence one each other. So these strands of theory not only focus on animals, but also other beings. And in the model of multispecies assemblies, I also focus not only on animals, but also on plants, natural entities, human children, future generations, and perhaps other groups like things. I will not speak about that too much today, because this conference focuses on animals, but I do want to note it because I think that it's very problematic to again focus on only a couple of groups like humans and other animals, and not take into account the interests of others. For example, in the case of plants, there's more and more research showing that they are beings with interests too, with complex languages, with social systems that are furthermore connected to animal systems. So I think we need a holistic approach to politics. Therefore, we need to also take into account these other agents. Of course, this asks for a model that's responsive to difference, but I will come to that in a little while. So viewing non-human beings like oaks and flies and dogs and mountains as the subject of political theorizing is in part a critical project. It asks for describing patterns of exclusion, injustice, for mapping structures of domination and comparing these in the case of non-humans to domination in the case of humans, and for challenging the hierarchies that seem normal because they are ingrained in our thinking and practices. But analyzing and describing injustice in this way is not enough. We also need to articulate alternatives. And to be able to articulate these alternatives, we need new forms of engaging with non-human others. Because if we just focus on including the interests of non-human others, like animals, but also plants, in existing political institutions and practices, and if we only represent them as humans, determining what's the good life for them, we risk repeating anthropocentrism and human dominance. And this is really problematic. And we risk this because humans would still decide what happens, but also because our systems of knowledge are biased. They are focused on humans. They respond to the hierarchies in society and reinforce them. There's quite a lot of research about how prejudice in biology and ethology actually distorts our ideas of animals. So we need to be very critical of these knowledge systems. And there's one other reason why we need to take these other beings into account, because a very important aspect of human domination over other animals is silencing them, devaluing their knowledge structures, making their labor invisible, for example, their forced labor for humans, but also their labor in ecosystems, and many, many other practices that deny their agency and background it. Backgrounding is a concept developed by Val Plumwood, an ecofeminist, and she points to the idea that the agency of women, but also animals, is very often relied on in society. So if you take out their agency and labor, the society falls apart. But at the same time, because of the power structures that are in place, it's denied. So it's a very effective model of domination, to deny the agency and wisdom of others. So when we develop new systems, we need to start with the voices and views of other animals and other beings. But this does not mean that we need to start from scratch, because existing institutions, practices, and concepts can play a very important role in the transition from the current anthropocentric status quo to multi-species justice. They would, however, need to be developed together with these other beings. So I should note that there are problems with current democratic systems for humans too. And the case of the climate crisis shows this very clearly. So in the Netherlands, we have a political system in which there are elections every 4 years. And politics is viewed as a struggle or a competition between interests. And both this model of struggle and the 4-year elections have an effect on what can be decided. So politicians are usually only focusing on their own voters and not seeking dialogue. In fact, there's less and less and less dialogue. It's more monologues in politics. But 4 years is also not the right time scale to make other decisions concerning climate change, because they stretch out much further. Furthermore, if you only focus on struggle and not care for others and the whole ecosystem, it's just not going to be the kind of decisions that we need. And there's also a large gap between politicians or politics and citizens, which makes it very difficult to work towards change, because people just turn away from politics and, stay on their laptop or their telephone screen and only yell about the things that they don't like, which is also why we now have an extreme right prime minister, but that's sort of beside the point. So, but it's not going great in the case of humans. And this is not only a matter, my point is, this is not a matter of content. It's also a matter of content, but it's also a matter of form. Representative democracy is very much influenced by capitalism and economic interests. So we need another form to be able to address ecological challenges, for example. And one model that has been popular in the past, 10, 15 years, but it's increasingly popular, so more people are turning towards it, is the model of assembly, citizens' assembly, mostly. Because these are, I will explain what they are in a bit. So this model of assembly is also promising, I think, in relation to non-humans, because they are tied to they're a form of direct democracy. So you actually interact with others and then make a decision, and they're tied to a specific location, a specific space. I will describe that in a little bit now. Just very briefly about the history of assemblies. Assemblies are an ancient model of political decision-making. You all know it from ancient Greece, where assemblies were the mode of government. People came together to decide in assemblies. They were called ecclesia, and they were the government in city-states. Citizens would gather on a hill, in a market place, amphitheater, or some kind of specifically designed building to discuss and decide upon common matters. But this form of government is not specifically European. David Graeber, the anarchist theorist, describes in Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology that many non-Western communities also governed and govern themselves in this way, through exercising direct democracy, using assemblies to deliberate. And they either do so in response to colonial oppression, state oppression, or this was just always how they governed their own society. So it's a model with a rich history and many different incarnations. And right now, you also have different forms of assembly. I already mentioned the citizens' assembly. Citizens' assemblies are usually a sort of model of, they have an advisory role. They are generally not the model for government, but they bring together a group of people through a process called sortition. So a lot of people get letters in the mail, and then they can decide to be part of the assembly. And the people organizing the assembly make sure that there's a good representation of society in the assembly. Assemblies assist from 50 to 200 members. And they are the members that are selected are given information about the political problem that they need to decide upon, and then given time to deliberate. So they basically come together, receive information, are educated, and then speak with each other. And this goes on. There's generally many cycles of deliberation, and then they come to a conclusion. There are also other forms of assembly. They're generally called popular assembly, and these are a form of government. And this can be, it can also be a model that's used in the workplace, so that workers come together. But with popular assemblies, the advice is binding. So it's actually the government, like the Greek ecclesia. There are different forms of these popular assemblies. I already mentioned anarchism. Anarchists look for ways of direct democracy to set up their decision making. But there are also, for example, the Zapatistas in Mexico, who set up their own model of government, which is also feminist and ecological, but really very much based on this idea that we need direct democracy. We need to come together to discuss. And in this context of the climate crisis that I discussed, assemblies are seen as fruitful because they overcome the gap between politics and citizens, because they offer a way of another way of decision making that is actually able to look far into the future and consider all interests that are involved. And for this reason, I mean, even though they are generally used as a kind of the advisory organ, they also have a radical side to them, because they show that it is possible. Humans are capable of another kind of decision making that is much more in line with care and the interests of all than based on this model of struggle. So assemblies are seen as important in playing a role in the transition to multi-species justice and in the context of the Anthropocene. However, they are only made up of humans. Even when they discuss the interests of nature, they're only humans. So for the Zapatistas, children are included. Everybody from 12 years, who is 12 years and older, can take part in the assembly. As you know, with the ancient Greeks, it was only free males, so a very small portion of society. Generally, in the citizens' assemblies, it's adult humans, and sometimes there are children involved too, or perhaps the age for taking part is 16 and over, but it's only humans. And this is problematic because I just discussed that we tend to repeat anthropocentrism, that our knowledge about other animals is flawed. So we need an account of multi-species assembly. We need that from the perspective of democracy, because it's a better system of decision making. And we need it from the perspective of animal justice. This is a way to do justice to their voices and their perspectives. So in this model of multi-species assembly, and I should note before I describe the model that it's only a first step. So how precisely these multi-species assemblies will evolve when we engage differently with other animals, I don't know. We see some examples of them in animal sanctuaries. I'm thinking specifically of Vine Sanctuary. That's an LGBTQ plus led sanctuary in Vermont, in the USA, where they are not conceptualizing the relationships with the animals as hierarchical, but really view the community as a multi-species community, actively search out animal agency, and actively base the decisions made on the agency of the animals involved. So there are already existing projects and experiments that focus on this kind of setup. But maybe we can discuss that in the questions a bit more. But yeah, I can only offer you the beginning of this multi-species assembly, because how it evolves depends on the interaction with the other animals. So as I said, multi-species assemblies are a form of direct democracy in which humans and non-humans speak about matters of common concern in embodied and situated processes of question and response. Some non-humans can speak for themselves. I think that with a lot of animals, this is not so difficult as people often make it out to be. I wrote about animal deliberation, for example, and there's a lot of literature in which humans and other animals can speak with each other about what matters. And the scope of the political changes, of course, when you discuss these questions with other animals, because it's not about very symbolic practices, it's really about daily life. And other non-humans in assemblies need to be represented. And here you can think of mountains or trees, but also certain communities of insects or communities of animals that are very far away. I think the relationships will change with humans and animals when we offer them more freedom. So if you set up this assembly structure of engaging with each other, the relations will change both with domesticated animals, but also with wild animals, because they don't need to be afraid of humans anymore. But there will still remain a distinction between entities that represent themselves and entities that need to be represented. The multi-species assembly model is similar to popular assembly, because everybody who has an interest in the questions that are being discussed should have a right to speak out and co-decide. And it can be a mode of multi-species government, like popular assembly. With citizens' assembly, the multi-species assembly shares the need for education and deliberation with regard to making informed decisions and developing new forms of interspecies interaction. So this is a very important point, because these multi-species assemblies are not just a mode for political decision-making, they are also a tool for generating new multi-species knowledge. And they therefore also require engagement. So there are, of course, large differences between human assemblies and multi-species assemblies, because in human assemblies, humans come together, they speak with each other in human language, they make a decision and they go. But with other animals, there will be much more attention for the process, because there are not like these single meetings in which we come together and decide. No, we are in a common area, and the humans can watch the other animals, build new habits and rituals with them. Animals can show humans how they feel about certain decisions. So there needs to be a lot of spatial and embodied experiment. Sue Donaldson wrote a text called Animal Agora, in which she argues that we need to sort of reclaim these public spaces in order to engage with other animals differently. And I think that that's very important. So multi-species assemblies are really tied to a specific space. In the text, I discuss lots of other elements of multi-species assemblies that differ from human assemblies. Like listening, for example, we need to do much more listening. We tend to focus as humans on speaking, but we will need to do more listening, knowledge building I discussed, respect for others, because obviously you're not going to eat the ones that you are in assembly with or use them for your own purposes. So it's a strong animal rights model. It's compatible with strong animal rights. I can't go into all of that now for reasons of space because I want to wrap up in a bit so we have some time for questions. But I do want to say something about the procedure. So in multi-species assemblies, I developed a couple of steps. So first, there needs to be someone who takes the initiative for the assembly. This can be a human, but it can also be in a multi-species community, an animal, a non-human animal, or a group of animals perhaps, or a multi-species group. Then there's a group probably existing of humans too, because humans need to do some work in this regard, of facilitators who map out what's going to be discussed and who should be involved, who has a right to speak, who should be represented. Then there's a process of deliberation. As I said, that's probably the most important step because this is also where we learn about others and sort of collectively develop new knowledge. Then in this process of deliberation, decisions will be made. For example, groups of animals can decide where they want to sleep. If you think about a transition from an anthropocentric society to a multi-species society, lots of animals will need to make up their minds about how they want to live beyond human domination. And then sometimes it can be that an assembly ended because there's no need for it anymore. For example, when there's a conflict between two communities, the conflict can be solved. Or when a group of animals decides to leave, then the assembly dissolves. But very often there will be a sort of ongoing need for assembly in the multi-species community, and how precisely this will look very much depends on all the different agents involved. So this is very briefly, in a nutshell, the model of multi-species assembly. And of course, this model seems to be very far removed from our day-to-day life, in which we are confronted with extreme domination over other animals in all kinds of ways, symbolic, material. You can find dead animal body parts in the supermarket. Humans construct roads that kill animals. So the examples are countless. There's violence everywhere. But I think that it's not, there won't be a revolution leading from anthropocentric society to multi-species justice. This will be a process of slow transformation, and it can also perhaps already exist in certain spaces because it is already possible to live differently, not for everybody, not in all contexts, but there is there's some room. And I want to end with some steps that we can take towards these multi-species assemblies. One of the things is moving from anthropocentric politics to a multi-species politics. I mentioned the Party for the Animals in the Netherlands. Obviously, the political situation in the Netherlands is very different than the political situation in Russia. We have multi-party government. So these are all things that function very differently. But I think that within the system that we have over here, these animal parties can play a role. Then there's, of course, activism, including academic activism, because producing new knowledge is part of moving towards a multi-species society. But then there are also cultural things we can do. So I've been writing about multi-species education. In Scandinavia, there's a strong tradition of nature education, children who are taught outside and also about nature. And I think that multi-species education is also important because research shows that very young children are not speciesist. So human beings, when they grow up, are socialized into speciesism. And I think that education is therefore very promising, especially for kids, but also for older humans, because we can develop other systems of learning and knowing in which not only humans, but also other animals can be teachers. All of this, of course, also asks for repositioning the human, but I think that this conference has been doing a lot of work in that regard as well, because that's something that all of us are concerned with. How can we live as humans in a larger living whole and not be the exception. And part of that can be cultural practices like veganism. There's a lot of critical thought about veganism. So I think that's changing a lot. But also the kind of stories that we tell, the art that we make, all of that. And ultimately, I think that it's important to notice that developing these alternatives to anthropocentrism involves more than changing simply the content of the conversation. We also need to work towards new forms of engaging with other animals. Yeah, perhaps in animal sanctuaries, there's a good reason for hope that we are capable of doing this differently. But I think that in our own lives, we can also change the way we approach politics and culture and all of these things. And here it's very important, I think, to remember that the other animals have other ways of doing things. So you can, as a human, learn from them and follow them and make that the basis of your thinking. So that's, I think, a reason for hope, that we don't have to figure out everything as humans. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about that too. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, Eva. So I hope you want to have a little discussions.
Yes.
Guys, dear colleagues, are there any questions? You can write them in the chat or you can ask them aloud. We have interpreters, so they can translate your questions in English into English. So there is a question in the chat. Can you see them?
Yes. What species of animals do you want to include in such assemblies? What about insects or worms? Well, I think that, as I said, when we look at assemblies, it's important to consider everybody in a given space, because if you only focus on one or two groups, for example, humans and dogs, or humans and domesticated animals, you run the risk of privileging their interests and going against the interests of worms or insects. And I think that very often our interests align more than we perhaps think. So, for example, if you take a tree, in my garden there are trees, and the bird that's sitting in the tree and the worms that are living underneath the ground, they all have very different ways of being. It's a different time scale. The life of the tree is much longer than that of the bird and the worms. It's a very different life, because the tree is rooted in one place and the worms are too, but the bird is flying and seeing the world, seeing much of the world in that sense. But at the same time, if there is pollution, all three parties benefit from the same kind of and pollution of the soil. So I think that in an assembly, there should be a recognition of the difference, because that's the basis of democracy anyway, I think so, also in the case of humans. But also, a focus on this question then, okay, pollution, what should we do? What's the best option for the worm, the tree, the bird, and perhaps the human in the situation too? For the bird, you can see in their behavior that they move to another place. So that's then their contribution to the deliberation. They move away. The tree and the worm can be represented by humans, at least in the current paradigm where we don't know so much about them. It's difficult to have a direct conversation with them. And I think that in this context, we can also learn from non-Western perspectives on animals and indigenous approaches to politics, because in these traditions of thought, it's much more common to consider trees as co-beings, plants as plant beings, communities of deer as deer communities, and not as animals like we do. So I think it's very much about also providing another image of reality, another narrative. So a simple answer would be, yes, we include insects and worms too, but we represent them. But then the longer answer is that, yeah, we also need a different narrative about how to do politics with others in a multi-species context. I see another question. Are there methods for understanding what animals need or want? It's easy to know if an animal would like a piece of food if we want to give that to them. But what about the more complex questions like, does a local group of animals agree with the proposal of planting trees in a certain place? Yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot of people are developing these methods at the moment. So I know that there are people doing critical ethology. So ethology is the study of animal psychology and behavior generally in the field. And these critical ethologists try to do this research in a non-colonial way, because for a very long time, we only used animals to get more knowledge about humans. So they try to develop alternatives. And I think that I, for example, wrote a book about multi-species dialogues that's coming out later this year. And in that book, I try to use the model of dialogue as a method for engaging with others, and then spatial embodied dialogues, so not the dialogues that we have here in words, but these kind of longer ongoing dialogues. So with regard to your question about the deer, I think that right now we would mostly rely on our imagination at first. You know, would they like it? What would it matter? Of what kind of difference would it make in their life world? It would provide them with shadow and also a place to hide. So they would probably like it. Or you can think, oh, it would obstruct their ideas for or their opportunities for finding food. So maybe they wouldn't like it. But when we live differently together with others for longer, a new understanding will also evolve between species in a given space. You, for example, find that in vine sanctuary. I mentioned that before. But what you see is that so in vine, lots of animals live together, like cows and chickens and sheep and many others. And some of the animals choose roles for themselves. So there's, for example, a group of cows that takes it upon them to greet newcomers. So they're the welcoming committee. Nobody gave them that job. They took that role for themselves. There are also chickens or roosters who, the roosters sound the alarm. So when there's a hawk coming, the roosters will give the specific hawk sound, and then others, like humans, but also dogs, can defend the community from these predators. So when you live together in a different way for a longer period of time, you begin to see each other differently and learn other things about others. There's another question. Will predators and their prey be able to coexist peacefully in such assemblies? I don't think so. So I think that humans also. So this is maybe more, how should I say it? It does depend a bit on your definition of peacefully. So there's a couple of responses I have to this. I think that humans have disrupted a lot of natural processes, and therefore we have a specific obligation towards certain communities like sheep. I know that sheep used to be able to protect their own communities better through process of domestication, and also keeping them apart from the predators. Humans changed this in them. So now in the Netherlands, we have a return of the wolf. But the sheep are not capable of protecting their communities anymore because they're not used to doing it. So they all get killed. And even like ponies and horses, they're not used to it anymore. But in the old days, there used to be more cultural practice for them to protect themselves against the predators. This is, of course, never a full guarantee. So there will always be predators. And I think that in different human cultural contexts, you also find different ways of living peacefully with predators. It's always difficult, but in some cultures, there's an understanding that this is part of life. You know, sometimes you lose someone from your own community, sometimes the other community loses one. It's part of coexisting in the larger web of things. The work of Val Plumwood also deals with that. What does it mean to see ourselves as humans as part of a larger whole? So I think that when we try to move towards a situation in which other animals experience more freedom, and when we are as humans more attuned to them, the situation will change, but there will still be conflict, and there will still be pain, and there will still be death. And this is also existential. It's political, but it's also existential. So yeah, this is something that I can elaborate on, but I see that there's one more question, and I think we have 2 minutes, so I should take that. What is more suitable for an assembly, hunting and picking up, or farming and gardening? Well, I find actually some of the most interesting examples of living differently in regenerative farming projects. There's, for example, in the Netherlands, a project called Stichting Capitalocene, the Capitalocene Foundation. And they try to develop another kind of farming that is in line with non-human animals and taking care of the land. So what they do is that when they farm, 50% goes to non-humans, 10% goes to the humans, and the remaining land is shared. So it's kind of a model, because in the Netherlands there's a lot of farming. We have all the meadows, and they're all completely the soil is completely depleted. So regenerative farming tries to let the soil heal itself and invite other animals back. And this Stichting Capitalocene also wants to move away from property, the idea that the land is our property. So they have a different model of working with money and the land. And I think it's a very promising and interesting idea that you give 50% to the non-humans, then there's 10% because, hey, humans need to eat too. So there's fruit and vegetables for the humans and some other foods. And then there's the remaining bit that you share. And that's also interesting, because how do you share? Because if you begin to plant things differently, this will invite animals and so on. So I think that hunting is definitely a no-go in this system. So yeah, thanks everybody for your questions and for listening to me.
So Eva, we have another 15 minutes.
Great.
And we can continue our discussion if you don't mind.
Yeah, more sure.
Yeah, okay. There was another question in the chat. Wait a minute. So Stanislav, I suggest he asks and try to compare your idea of multi-species assemblies with the idea of oral animal farm, but in the future. Maybe you have some comments to this comment.
Yeah, I think that Orwell is mainly trying to make a statement about human politics and how humans deal with each other and how power relations work out in the case of humans. And I think that human beings are I think that so what you see in the Netherlands with the Party for the Animals is that they propose an approach to politics that is not focused on the human, but on the whole, that is not focused on economic growth, as many societies still are, but instead wants to promote well-being. And this leads to a completely different understanding of why what we do when we do politics. So it's not this kind of power struggle that Orwell also criticizes, but it's much more based on cooperation and the idea that given the challenges that all of us face now, we are in the same boat, humans, other animals, and nature as a whole. So I think that there is there's a need for another view of politics, which is also connected to another view of humanity and human beings, because we are, as humans, very used to viewing ourselves as singled out, apart from the rest of the world, but and in struggle with the rest of the world. But feminist theorists and scholars have really emphasized that we can also approach the human condition from the perspective of relations and cooperation. And this offers a very different view on what we do when we engage into public debate with others and when we make political decisions.
Yes, so Jana, I guess you can address your question.
Спасибо большое за ваш потрясающий.
Thank you so much for your amazing and such interesting presentation and for your research as well. My question is as follows. Hypothetically, how would you imagine political organizations? What consensus methods and compromise methods could they use for multi-species assemblies? What methods that humanity already has could be applied without talking about domination or building hierarchies? And in your opinion, to what extent is this even possible? The way we are already organizing our political organizations, is to say, are we able to inscribe this into them? And in which political theories could we borrow these methods from? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an important and also far-reaching question. And I think that in this context, I mostly, in the context of or setting up these multi-species assemblies, I mostly looked at anarchist theory. So I think a lot of anarchists are used to working from the ground up, simply getting together, then discussing and sort of embracing also the messiness of interaction and the difficulty of it and the misunderstandings, and then trying to come to a better to collective decisions together, mostly based on consensus, and sometimes when it's impossible, based on voting. But there's also now in political animal philosophy, there are other proposals for working towards multi-species justice. Like, for example, multi-species justice theory that's developed by scholars like Danielle Eva and Christine Winter. They write from the context in Australia and draw a lot also on Aboriginal knowledge, and in New Zealand, the Maori knowledge. So basically they try to find another way of looking at justice. So a non-anthropocentric interpretation of the concept justice, and also connect this to a holistic approach to the land and connect to indigenous political philosophy. And another approach that I mentioned briefly is the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, who start with liberal democracy and argue that, the tools of liberal democracy, the basic ideas of equality and freedom, are suitable for engaging differently with other animals. And I think that all of these approaches have their own strengths and weaknesses. So because we, at least I in the Netherlands and we in Europe, and Sue and Will are writing from Canada, are living in these liberal democracies, this is, of course, a very pragmatic way of going about animal justice. And you also see that in animal rights, of course, and rights of nature discourse. These are also ways in which humans try to establish more respect for others. And I think because the situation is so bad for animals, because there's so much domination and it's so far-reaching, I think we should use all of these tools. And I think that my contribution is that we need to also always let our acts as activists, but also in politics, be informed by actual engagement with animals, because their perspective needs to be central. And I think that I'm hoping to make a longer research project out of this, because I think that in order to be able to answer your question better, it's necessary to be very precise and specific about where does the deliberation take place? Where is the assembly? For example, in my garden, the situation is very different than another ecosystem or another setup. So it's important to look at these very local situations. So that's more my contribution, and there are examples of people working on this. But there are also lots of other approaches to animal politics and animal rights, and I think that all of these contribute to to decentering the human, and that is kind of the cultural task that we need to do. And the cultural and the political go hand in hand. So it's not a very tangible answer, but these are my thoughts about that.
Yes, thank you, Eva, for the answer. There is another question in the chat. Can you see it?
Yeah, is it possible that one day science will provide ethical food that will be suitable for predators to sustain themselves? And would it be a moral necessity for us to defend prey from predators and at the same time provide predators with healthy alternatives? So Martha Nussbaum writes that we should gradually replace the natural with the just. And this is an interesting sentence that I sometimes think about. So what Nussbaum says is that, yes, there's so much suffering in nature that we should indeed, as humans, intervene and do precisely what you do, you propose, actually. And I think that there are some instances in which it could be a good solution for everybody. Think of the polar bears who are now starving because of the changes in the ecosystem and the melting of the glaciers and everything and the ice. So I think that, if we're going to feed the polar bears, let's do it in that way. So one of the things is that as humans, we currently intervene a lot. There are a lot of projects, for example, to protect certain predators. For example, tigers who are near extinction. humans invest a lot of money in that, and they protect them and they take care of them. And that's a choice, because if you do that as humans, then you know that these predators are also going to be attacking others. At the same time, humans are responsible for their extinction generally. So you can also say that we have a moral duty towards these predators to assist them in sustaining their community and all of that. I think that at this point, it's in a sense, so while it's a relevant question how to deal with predators, I'm not sure if focusing on that aspect of human non-human animal relations is the most fruitful at this point in time. I think it's better to focus on human violence against other animals than on animal violence towards other animals, because human violence against other animals is pretty straightforward, right? We can eat all the. I mean, there was a large press event a couple of days ago in the Netherlands with these the kind of new fake meat. I forgot the term in English, but. So humans have alternatives, and they can choose to live differently. At the same time, our lives are, of course, intertwined with the lives of other animals. And as I said, I think that predator-prey relations are a fact of life, an existential fact of life. At the same time, we have lots of responsibilities. And it's also not the only form of violence that exists, right? I mean, over here, the male ducks are fed a lot, so they are bored, and then they all rape the female ducks, and some of the female ducks die because there are so many male ducks on them. If I see that, I intervene because I don't want the female ducks to die. So there is violence in the lives of other animals too, but I think we should first focus on human violence, and then address these questions when they arise, again, in very local settings. I think that we here behind our computer are not in the position to make very general statements about this. But I do think in some instances it might be worth, or if in animal rehabilitation centers or spaces where animals are fed meat, also think about cats, for example, in shelters. I think it's a very good alternative.
So yeah, thank you for the answer. We have a little time, but I want to ask you a last question, and if you can answer shortly, it will be great. So you've mentioned the Sue Donaldson's Animal Agora, and can you say what is the fundamental difference between your concept of animal assemblies and her concept of Animal Agora?
I think that for Sue Donaldson, it's an experiment that takes place in the context of liberal democracy. So what she wants to show is that there are processes of decision-making in which humans and other animals engage that can inform existing human systems of decision-making. And I think that for Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, there is a larger role for humans than for me. That's the first difference. The second difference is that my model not only focuses on animals, but also on the other beings like trees, plants, etc. A third difference is that I think that we need more sort of ongoing processes of deliberation as a form of government. So it's more, for me, it's more direct democracy, so that actual decisions are made for the society. And for Sue, it's more a way of finding out the animal's opinion and then incorporating these in our more human processes of decision making. At the same time, so these are the kind of more formal differences. It's just a different idea of democracy and how democracy works. But I think we very much share the intuition about how deliberation works in the case of animals. So that you don't sit around the table, but you really go into these spaces and you can, for example, plant certain things, or you can make a pond, or you can, I don't know, discuss things with animals through interventions in the landscape, but also objects like toys, games, and all of these things. So in terms of how we feel about deliberation, it's very similar.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm personally very pleased with your participation in our conference, and your works inspire me a lot. And I must admit that your books and your papers are my favorite books and papers, among other papers and books on animal studies or critical animal studies. So we are all waiting for your publications, and thank you very much again for your participation. I hope to collaborate with you in the future. Thank you very much, Eva.
That would be great. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the participants for your great questions. I've not spoken about this. I've not been speaking about this a lot, so it's very nice to get your feedback on it. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.